Family has a way of cutting deeper than strangers ever could. It's one thing when the world looks down on you, but when it's your own blood. That wound F-E-S-T-E-R taught my story isn't just about a cruel insult or a broken family dinner. It's about betrayal. It's about watching the people who raised me sneer at the man I loved, calling him just a farmer as if his hard work made him less human, less worthy. They looked at his hands, calloused from soil and harvest, and judged. They looked at his quiet dignity and laughed. And when my sister joined in, the golden child, the one they always preferred, I knew the divide was deeper than I wanted to admit. The fate is funny. Because months later, when their perfect world collapsed, it was me and my just a farmer husband they came crawling to for help. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. Stay with me, because the way I got revenge still makes my hands shake even now on quiet nights sometimes. I grew up in a family that worshipped appearances. My parents weren't rich, not by any real measure, but they clung to status as if it were oxygen. Their lives revolved around polished images and polished church galas where they pretended we were wealthier than we were. Endless neighborhood gossip about who drove what car, and hushed conversations about which families were worth marrying into. In that carefully curated little world, my sister Clara was their crown jewel. Blonde, polished, ambitious, everything I wasn't. She became a lawyer, worked downtown in a gleaming office tower, and lived in a high-rise apartment with city views. My parents paraded her around like a prize they had won. Our daughter, the lawyer, they would beam, as if her every breath somehow reflected their greatness, and me. I was the quiet one, the bookworm who spent hours in the library, the daughter who stayed home to help with chores when they hosted their shallow little parties. I didn't resent Clara, not at first. I thought it was simply the natural order of things. She was the star. I was the shadow. Then I met Daniel. He wasn't flashy. No tailored suits, no expensive watch, no perfect rehearsed laugh. He was a farmer running his family's land a few miles outside town. He worked sunrise to sunset, strong hands marked with soil and sun. His face tanned, his smile soft and genuine. There was no pretense in him, no need to prove anything to anyone. He was solid, steady, real, and I fell for him. Hard and fast. When I brought him home to meet my family, I thought maybe it would be awkward at worst. Maybe they'd ask curious questions about farm life. Maybe there'd be jokes I'd have to smooth over. But what I got instead wasn't awkwardness. It was poison dot at dinner. Clara tilted her chin and smirked as she asked, "So, Daniel, do you ever plan to get a real job? Or is dirt under the fingernails your permanent aesthetic?" The table laughed. My mother chuckled behind her wine glass. My father smirked like she'd said something clever. I froze, waiting for someone to step in, to soften the jab, to correct her cruelty. But no one did. Daniel stayed polite. He always does. He smiled that quiet smile and gave some humble answer about the farm being steady, honest work. But I caught it, the flicker in his eyes, that tiny sting of humiliation, and it didn't stop there. Over the months, it only got worse. Every holiday, every gathering, they found a way to jab at him, and by extension, at me. You could have done better. At least Clara found someone successful. Farm life is cute when you're young, but you'll regret it. Each comment was another needle under my skin, another stone in my chest. The worst came when Thanksgiving. Daniel had spent hours harvesting fresh produce, baking pies, even pressing cider from apples on the farm. He wanted to bring something wholesome, something made with love. He laid it all out beautifully on my parents' table, proud. Smiling at the thought of sharing it with them, Clara didn't even touch her plate. Instead, she leaned toward my mother and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "Can you believe she tied herself to just a farmer?" And they laughed. My mother, my father, my sister, All of them laughed at the man who loved me more than anything. That night, I broke. I pressed my face into Daniel's chest, tears soaking his shirt as I swore I would never let them disrespect him again. But he held me close, kissed my hair, and whispered, "Let it go. Time will show them who we really are." I tried to believe him. I really did. But even as his warmth wrapped around me, resentment was already taking root in my heart. Growing stronger with every cruel word they'd spoken, time moved like a tractor across the field slow, inevitable, marked by seasons. Daniel and I built a life together out of sweat and stubbornness. The farm expanded. A greenhouse, better seeds, a small delivery route that started with neighbors and grew into a steady list of customers. He learned bookkeeping, I learned packing. We learned how to make our produce look like something from a city market. We weren't flashy. We were steady, and we were proud that my parents either didn't notice or refused to acknowledge what we built. For them, success was not soil and grit. It was corner offices, branded luggage, the right schools. A thriving delivery list meant nothing beside Clara's glass-walled office and a new car in the driveway. The betrayal came disguised as politeness. A Sunday brunch invite felt rehearsed. Clara sat poised and perfect in a bright dress, my parents nervously smoothing napkins. Midway through coffee, my mother's voice dropped into careful tone. "Sweetheart, Clara needs a loan. 20,000 should do it." 20,000. The number landed like a stone in my stomach. I asked for an explanation. Dad offered vague excuses, bad investments, firm transitions, then finished with a line that froze me. "We thought since you and Daniel are comfortable now." Comfortable. The word tasted like contempt. We were comfortable the way people are after Anna's worked hard but secure. Not lavish but safe because we planned and saved. Every dollar we had was earned under sun and rain, not handed down or splashed on Instagram. Daniel's hand found mine beneath the table. I answered carefully, listing our obligations, the farmhouse mortgage, tractor payments, the small emergency fund we'd guarded like a secret. "We can't," I said. "We don't have that kind of money." Clara's smile sharpened. "Oh, please, don't act like you don't have money. What do you spend it on? Overalls and fertilizer?" Her voice was syrupy with contempt. My parents didn't flinch. They looked at me as if the right answer was obvious. My failure to comply would be a moral failing. I felt something cold uncoil in my chest. The betrayal wasn't only the request, it was the entitlement behind it. They had spent years treating Daniel like scenery, laughing at him in my presence, then presumed his labor should bankroll their daughter's mistakes. They expected me to be the bridge between their world and the life I had chosen. That night, under a sky thick with stars, I sat on our porch and let the anger settle like dust. Daniel stood in the doorway watching silently, the edges of his face softened by lamplight. When I told him, his jaw tightened, but he did not rage. He squeezed my hand and said, "They always valued what sparkled. We're not sparkling, and that's fine." The words steadied me, but they did not soothe the sting. I remembered the Thanksgiving when he brought pies and cider, and Clara whispered, loud enough for the table to hear. She tied herself to a farmer. I remembered the way my mother's laugh had punctured his pride. How my father's silence had condoned it. Betrayal braided with humiliation, and from that knot grew a hard resolve. I would not be the bank for their image. I would not let them take the fruit of our labor to prop up lies. It was no longer enough to endure or to hope time would teach them. If they were going, I didn't lash out right away. Revenge, I told myself, had to be slow and surgical, more like pruning than burning. If I wanted the people who had laughed at Daniel to feel the precise weight of their cruelty, I would have to plan that first. I started gathering information. I listened to casual phone calls, watched Clara's social media for dates and flights. and paid attention to the small slips my parents made about money. Claire's life glittered online: dinners, boutique bags, perfect weekend posts. But behind the gloss were late payment notices and hushed conversations I could overhear when I was visiting them. Daniel urged caution. He said time would show the truth. But time without action felt like waiting for rain in a drought, a college friend in finance obliged with quiet guidance. He explained margin calls and red flags, and he dug up public filings I couldn't access easily. I learned that Clara's investments were propped by loans she couldn't cover. There were liens on her car, a quiet complaint at her firm, a pattern of spending above her means. My parents were quietly liquidating small assets to cover interest-selling antiques, awkwardly pawning heirlooms. They did it with such desperate, polite secrecy that it smelled like panic, masked as propriety. That was the map. I traced the edges and picked my tools. Step 1, play the good daughter. I softened my voice and asked Clara to bring every paper. She arrived smug, expecting pity. I read through spreadsheets and loan notices while she smiled and rehearsed her excuses. I asked small, precise questions: dates, names, amounts. She answered with practice lines, unaware that I was collecting the very details that would undo her. Step 2, plant the seeds. I fed anonymous tips to a reporter I trusted enough to spark interest, but not to prove everything at once. Screenshots of extravagant posts, fragments of invoices, a hint about an internal review at her firm. I also let casual remarks slip in conversations with neighbors. I heard legal troubles at Clara's office. People love to connect dots for you. Some started looking closer. The rumor moved like wildfire in dry brush. Step 3, stage the reveal. We invited my family for dinner at the farmhouse. No traps, just a warm table. Daniel cooked until the house smelled of bread and roast. He set out candles as if we were welcoming old friends. I wanted them to see the life they mocked: honest, nourishing, quietly accomplished. When the moment came, I spoke without venom. "Clara," I said, "I looked at your paperwork." I didn't accuse. I described inconsistencies. Her face strained, my mother's hands went still, my father's jaw tightened. Daniel's role was quiet but vital. When I finished, he added one measured line that landed like a verdict: "We can't give you the money." He wasn't triumphant. He was simply unmoved, as if truth were a tool he knew how to use. The table fell into a silence that was its own punishment. Step 4, let the system work. The reporter published a piece that wasn't sensational so much as surgical fact-based. Sourced, humiliating in its clarity. It outlined unpaid obligations, the investigation at her firm, and the contradiction between public life and legal exposure. Readers responded with the kind of cruelty reserved for fallen idols. Colleagues distanced themselves. Creditors called. The firm placed her on leave pending inquiry. My parents tried to shield Clara, but their resources were thinner than their public persona suggested. They sold investments they'd like to boast about and took loans with terms that would strangle them later. The neighborhood that once winked at their good fortune now whispered about their precariousness. And Daniel? The very work they had scorned turned into something else. People began to respect the farm, to value honest labor. Word spread about the delivery boxes, about produce grown with care. Local restaurants called. Customers who had once scrolled past our posts stopped to sign up. Support arrived in slow, steady waves, not flashy, but real. I never shouted their sins from a rooftop. I didn't need to. Truth, once arranged, does its own damage. My revenge was not about humiliation for its own sake. It was about balance. They had dismissed and devalued what Daniel's hands produced. I merely arranged for the ledger to reflect reality. Even then, nights were complicated. I loved my family in a way that didn't disappear simply because they'd been cruel. Sometimes guilt prickled. Had I gone too far? But then I remembered Clara's face as she sneered at his hands, the polite laughter around that table. The memory hardened into resolve. In the end, it wasn't fireworks. It was a slow harvest, truth maturing, reputation decaying, and a quiet life growing steadier in the shadow of their fall. And I watched it all unfold with a strange, cold satisfaction. The family reunion had always been Clara's arena. She arrived early in past years, hair perfect, tray of conversation starters in hand, a practice laugh ready. This time, the atmosphere was brittle before she walked in. People had read, people had whispered, and the air smelled of something like expectation and relief. When she finally stepped through the door, she was late and plain. Where sparkle had been, there was an exhausted gray. She kept her head down. The smile that used to curve so easily felt ... Conversation stuttered. Eyes tracked her. Somebody offered a tentative pity. The old uncles who once nudged each other as she talked about awards now frowned like magistrates. My parents sat with faces forward, mouths compressed, hands finding each other's knuckles like anchors. They kept looking toward me as if I might perform some public absolution and mend what had been torn. Then an uncle. I'd always liked practical. The sort who measures people by their work stood up and raised his glass. "To Daniel," he said plainly, "for reminding us what real work looks like." The words landed like a bell. It kept precisely where the jabs had aimed for years. Worth. Glasses chimed. Voices lifted in unexpected praise. Comments that once belonged to Clara that she really did well. And isn't that some things? Now went to the man whose hands had been the butt of their jokes. I watched Clara's fingers curl around her glass until her knuckles whitened. My mother stared at the tablecloth as if seeing the weave for the first time. My father's jaw worked. I couldn't tell whether it was shame or anger. Daniel lifted his glass as if embarrassed by the attention. His smile was small and genuine, not the practiced smile of someone performing. In that smile, there was also something quiet and unbearable, the knowledge that this moment belonged to truth, not to spectacle. He had not sought vindication. He had simply kept working. Something inside me unwound years of tightness, of swallowed words and clenched teeth. The revenge was not a roar. It was a soft, inexorable settling. They had wanted 20,000. They had been offered nothing and instead forced to face their own reflection. Their reputation had cracked. Their pride had bled. They might buy things back, but they could not reclaim the look in a room the night the crowd chose the farmer over the lawyer. Clara left early that night. Shoulders folded, the sound of her heels hollow in doorway. Vindication washed over me clean. Cold and absolute. I raised my glass too, and it was not triumph that filled me, but a quiet, terrible relief. The harvest had finally come. It's been months since everything came crashing down. Clara had to move back in with my parents after selling her luxury apartment. Their once grand house was sold off too, piece by piece, to cover her debts. The three of them live quietly now, away from the spotlight they used to chase, avoiding the neighbors who once admired them. Meanwhile, Daniel and I are thriving. The farm is bigger than ever, our delivery service is booming, and people who once looked down on us now shake Daniel's hand with respect. They see what my parents never could, that worth isn't measured in bank accounts or brand names, but in character and consistency. Do I feel guilty? Sometimes. They're still my family. But then I remember the laughter at Daniel's expense, the smug looks, the way they treated him like dirt. They asked me to choose between their approval and the man who loves me. I chose him, and I would make that choice every single time because money fades. Status fades. But how you treat people, that echoes forever. And when you mock just a farmer, don't be surprised when the harvest you reap turns out bitter.